Good morning to everyone, and welcome to our second day, or rather our three-quarter day, because we'll be finishing at 1 o'clock, pre-lunch. Don't worry, you'll still get morning tea. We had a very full day yesterday considering the global challenge and how that applies locally, and then focusing on three streams of work. The first one yesterday was on waste, and today we have wood and water. And so wood and water will occupy us for most of the day, but crucially the very last session of the day, from about 12:30 to 1, we'll be having a plenary discussion about how we can best take these things forward and help give some lend support, contribute ideas and energy to the work of Activate Tairawhiti and all the other organisations that have been involved in this programme towards creating a circular economy here in the Tairāwhiti Gisborne region. The lovely task falls to me to talk a little bit about forestry, so that's going to be the first bit this morning. So Harley asked me if, knowing that I have a keen interest in the sector, to say a few things that would frame the subsequent discussion up until morning tea about various aspects of the forestry sector. And for me, the starting point for forestry is that I keep a mental model in my head of many sectors in the economy. And I've always been able to articulate something of a view of what the best opportunities for those sectors are. For many years, forestry was by far the hardest, and I really struggled with that one. But in recent years, I think some real clarity is emerging around forestry. And so my goal in this short presentation this morning is just to set that very big context, which I hope will then be helpful for the subsequent sessions. What I'm talking about is about valuing our trees, a rather bland suggestion, but I want to stress that term value in many ways, beyond the economic, obviously, to the environmental and cultural and all the rest. I always like a romantic title too. One I use often is Reinventing Paradise. This place is, but that's the work we need to do. And I'm going to get to forestry through two other intermediary steps. The first one is to talk briefly about our home, this planet, and then a few things about Aotearoa before I get on to forestry itself. This is the view of us from the front garden, if you could call it that, of our nearest neighbour. That's the barren moon, and we're about 240,000 miles away from it. Reversing the picture, that little white dot up towards the left-hand corner is the moon, and that's a wonderful picture of the planet. And it's that blue bit that I find most fascinating, because that's the biosphere. Everything that's living on the planet is alive in the biosphere and alive because of it. But the biosphere is surprisingly thin. Although you can find stray atoms of atmosphere 500 kilometres up, the reality is that all the air that we need to breathe is in the first 10 kilometres. I'm a keen cyclist. If those kilometres were horizontal and it was a flat road, I would run out of oxygen in 15 minutes. So that's how thin that layer is. So that's the oxygen and water vapour there too, of course. And then this incredibly thin, gossamer thin layer of soil and water that then supports us. But into that atmosphere, last year we pumped 37 billion tonnes of CO2 and its equivalent, which explains a fair amount about what is going on in the world these days. This is a wonderful graphic from a British scientist, Adam Neiman. So if we brought all that atmosphere together in one place, it would be a little balloon barely 2,000 kilometres across. Next year I've got a bike ride from Cape Reinga to Bluff, off-road mostly, and that's a 3,000 kilometre bike ride down New Zealand. All the water in the world, that includes all the oceans, which are mostly quite shallow, but it's all the groundwater, it's aquifers as best as we can measure them, it's all the water in the atmosphere. If you brought that together in one place, it would only be a droplet, barely 1,400 kilometers across. But all the fresh water in the world, the surface fresh water, would only be 62 kilometers across in that, which is, of course, doesn't even get you anywhere much up the coast from here. This is a wonderful graphic from one of my Edmund Hillary fellows, Felix, and his company Globia. And this is the output of CO2 around the world. Obviously, the more intense is the red and oranges. And this is on a cycle through 24 hours. And you can see how these great waves of CO2 emissions rise and fall as in the economic and sort of human life of the planet. It's an astonishing graphic because it's incredibly beautiful, but it's also incredibly sinister. But it's part of the great wonder of this great creation. Felix does lots of work with Rockström and others in Stockholm at the Resilience Centre and is very involved in all the planetary boundaries work. And as we've heard yesterday, the biggest overshoot is on phosphorus and nitrogen, entirely because of the way we grow food. But that also impacts land use change there around about 9 o'clock. And then, of course, the very big impact on the loss of biodiversity. If you take out the permanent ice and snow and look at just the rest of the land mass in the world, humans actively manage, badly, 75% of the Earth's surface. So every year, we humans and our activities move more of the Earth's surface than do natural processes. Here in New Zealand, we wash 200 million tons of soil off our bush and our mountains and our paddocks, most of that going down rivers, clogging them up, strangling estuaries and coastal areas. And then, of course, this is the sixth great extinction of species. The 5 previous ones were all natural phenomenon. This is the first created by humans, but of course we are a natural phenomenon in that sense, and we need to recognize that we are a natural phenomenon. Wonderful book, Elizabeth Colbert, on that very subject. So this is the Anthropocene, as geologists call it. This is the first geological epoch in the history of the planet, 4.5 billion years, in which humankind, a life species, is the dominant driver of planetary change. So we are changing the planet far more powerfully than any other factor. Yes, there are technological solutions. So if we look at what we need to do over the next 20 years, it's a massive technological change, and we can understand broadly some of those pathways which will get us there. But of course, the technology in itself can't save us. It's the values that we apply to the planet, but also the values we apply to those technologies, which will determine whether we manage to save ourselves. The planet will be fine, it'll just morph into something else, but it's a question about how we as a life form continue. So then that takes us on to Aotearoa. Just a few weeks ago, the Minister of the Environment launched Environment Aotearoa 2019. This is the second of its once every 4 years synthesis report, where they bring together the data in their domain reports of freshwater, land, atmosphere, and climate. And this is just one of the graphics, and it's a really important one because it lays out the 5 themes that lie behind this. And I would really encourage you to read the report, but just the summary report, even just to look at this graphic on page 5 of the summary report, because down at the bottom is how we live and make a living, and then the things we value. And so across these 5 big themes of the destruction we're doing, what we're up to and what we're trying to achieve and what we value are absolutely inextricably linked and intertwined. Today's a really important day because the government is going to be announcing the bill for a Zero Carbon Act. And in preparation of that, one of the very helpful pieces of work is from the Productivity Commission on our transition to a low emissions economy. And this is a quote from one of their pieces of work in that. The shift from the old economy to a new low emissions economy will be profound and widespread. Transforming land use, the energy system, production methods and technology, regulatory frameworks and institutions. And here's the biggest, and business and political culture. It's about learning to do things in a very, very different way. And so this isn't incremental change. This has to be an unprecedented speed of change, scale of change, and complexity of change that humankind hasn't come within cooey of before. That's our task. I won't dwell on this. This is from the vivid economics work for backbench MPs, various scenarios about a net zero New Zealand top right, resourceful New Zealand, we get there on emissions, but a huge amount of forestry and not much progress elsewhere, and then off track and where we are today. Clearly forestry has a very important role in this. It's not just about trees being a sink, and of course that's a sink that's only going to work for the next 20 or 30 years. We've got to actually make after that, or in the process of that, permanent actual reductions in emissions, because there's a limit to how many trees we can plant. But forestry is utterly crucial. Let me just say a few things about us and trees. We're rather an odd country in this respect because we have a lot of trees, but we don't have any overarching long-term policy for them. We have all sorts of bits and pieces. So currently, our short-term forestry decisions deliver very adverse outcomes, both economic and environmental, of course, and social and the like. And on this current course, this is going to get worse because we want to plant a billion trees by 2027 to do climate things, regional economic development, stop that soil erosion, improve water quality, improve biodiversity. So we're rushing to plant an awful lot of trees. The catch cry is now the right tree in the right place, which is a start. But I just want to reflect a little bit on the nature of the challenge. Currently we have about 6.5 million hectares of native trees, which of course are almost all in non-harvestable conservation estate or in permanent forests, and 1.7 million hectares of exotics, almost all of course harvestable. But that billion trees represents about another 2.8 million hectares, which means that we're more than doubling in a very, very short time the plantings that we're doing. So getting the right mix of trees is a really important part. But the other part is the economic drivers behind it, which is why I'm going to focus on China. China is, for example, the world's largest paper manufacturer. It produces 30% more paper than the United States, which is the second largest manufacturer. But it has very limited wood and fiber resources. So now 18 months ago, it was importing at an annual rate more than 100 million cubic meters of wood a year. And that was forecast to rise to 700 million cubic meters of wood by 2020. So we're already incredibly important to China. We are their largest source of logs. Very sadly, though, most of those logs, or the largest use of those logs, is for concrete boxing. It's for formwork, so the Chinese can pour concrete. Well, there isn't much of a second life for wood that's being used that way. That, quite frankly, is a scandalous use of a wood, and it's really hard to turn that around. particularly because 75% of our exports, forestry exports, are dominated by a China state-owned enterprise, China Forestry. They also have bought forests here in New Zealand. And their strategy is incredibly clear, to scour the world, that's my word, not theirs, for wood resources for plants in China. And meanwhile, other countries are restricting log exports. We are the last unrestricted exporter of logs in the world. And so, for example, Russia has a 20% tariff and is pushing, has a timetable towards 100% tariff. And so there's a lot more processing, some of it Chinese investment in Russia. Then we're starting to see perverse things happening. We're starting to see on sale here in New Zealand sawn timber, which has come from China sawmills, which have been using New Zealand logs, which shows how incredibly perverse this is getting. So this is how we grow trees currently. This is Kangaroa. And radiata pine, I'm sorry to be so rude about it, but it is an utter commodity. It's not a great wood. I'm actually using the word mediocre there, and $40 a cubic metre. Well, prices are spiking, but it's hard to get more than that. But there are other trees to grow. I mean, totara are absolutely gorgeous trees, naturally rot resistant. Fence posts from totara lasts for decades, if not centuries. And the work of MB for Northland, when it was looking at a Northland regional forest strategy a couple of years ago, reckoned that the value of totara was about $2,500 a cubic metre. So working out how to do harvestable native trees, I think, is a really important part of the way forward. This is how we harvest trees. That's a little unfair, but it's not an untypical photo. But this is how we could harvest trees. This is how they harvest trees in Germany. For centuries, they have had a sense of living forests where there is selective harvesting and replanting rather than a clear-cut process, which obviously does astonishing damage to the land on which it is. This is how we use trees. The vast bulk of our trees are only logs, which are exported. This was a picture the Herald took in Gisborne port a couple of years ago. But this is how we could use trees. This beautiful building opened in Brisbane in November last year. It's the world's tallest office building. It's 10 stories, 52 metres tall. And we'll be hearing more about such uses of wood in due course. But wood is such a fabulous construction material. Unlike concrete, which a ton of concrete produces a ton of CO2 emissions, wood is sequestering carbon emissions. Just imagine how much carbon is locked up in that building for a very, very long time, just as carbon is wonderfully secure in this wharenui. There are lots of ideas around. So the New Zealand Institute of Forestry has been thinking about this for a while, and mid last year produced an outline forest policy for New Zealand. So foresters, at least the progressive ones, have a good idea of what needs to be done. But we're really struggling, they're really struggling to get any kind of traction in government. One last point is that these are the 6 great waves of technological innovation, starting with steam and coal back 200 years ago, and moving on to digital and biotech, etc., the 5th wave. But the 6th wave is about sustainability, radical resource productivity, whole system design, biomimicry, green chemistry, industrial ecology, renewable energy, and green nanotechnology. Quite simply, this is a brilliant opportunity for us because most of those are biologically based in some ways, and yet the biological sciences are the ones we have the most experience in progressing and commercializing. And so the very exciting thing about it is this is the first wave of technology which is of regenerative technology, things that can not only stop doing damage but start giving the biosphere a chance to heal itself. whereas all those other ones are deeply, deeply extractive. This is an example of how wonderfully this works. Naituhoi, when they reached their settlement, they didn't rush out and buy a Novotel or a dairy farm, as some other iwi have done. They decided to build a house, the Takura Whare, because this is about building the people and the community. And they found wonderful woods in the Uraweras to build this beautiful building. But it's a very notable building because it meets the international standards for a living building, i.e. a building which is self-sufficient for energy and water. But it looks nothing like other living buildings around the world because it's an expression of who Tūhoe are and where they are in the Uraweras, where they are in Aotearoa. And I think this is fundamentally important, that as we progress on these issues, each place is very true to itself and its own identity. So that's going to be very true here in Gisborne, Tairāwhiti, even though you are working on global issues and finding solutions which have a lot of commonality with things people are doing elsewhere. But they are absolutely an expression of who you are, because in restoring the land and the economy, you are restoring the people as well. Lastly, this is a very difficult quote. When I first read it 4 years ago, I didn't understand it, and I found it very disturbing. But let me preface it by saying this. Civilization is important, but if you like, it's our operating system. It's the knowledge we have accumulated and the values we have that then put that knowledge to work. Civilizations evolve, things change. So this is the task ahead of us. This is a wonderful quote from Roy Scranton, an American writer, and his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. And he said quite simply, well, I just leave you to read that. It's better to read than to be read to. Thank you.